Hello, welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. My guest today is a very, very unusual and interesting man who is a historian. His name is Larry Kidder, and he has been doing mostly history about the era of the American Revolution. How timely is that? And of course, what's interesting, Larry told me about his own family history is they go back to the Mayflower. This is a family that's been here a very long time. So it's no surprise that Larry, very early in his years, in his teens, found an interest in history and an interest in this particular period, the American Revolution. Larry, welcome.
Thank you, Joan.
And your research in the past has been about, you say it's about people because history is what makes people's lives. Isn't that what you said to me?
Right. Yeah.
So
when I'm doing history, I like to focus on individual lives, and not always the very famous individual lives, but the people who experienced history and helped make history through their lives and maybe aren't remembered all that well, but I like to know how it affected them as an.
That's so important, because that's what I think what made me a sociologist was the fact that I could see that the bigger world affects and defines our lives in many ways. And that's what I like looking at. So we're on the same page, Larry. Yep. Okay. Now, you are working on a book right now. It's your new book, and it's called The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man. And what you're taking up is something that is just starting to be looked at, racial issues, as it was during that period of the American independence. And in fact, as I mentioned to you, Larry, in today's New York Times, there's a front page article about a woman who has a farm in Georgia that she's inherited, and they're discovered that the people who worked for them were slaves. And this is one of the era that people haven't talked about much, have they?
Right. And for my research, it's a little different because one of the things that excited me about doing the free black man that I'm doing, whose name is Jacob Francis, he was a free black. He was never enslaved. And he was born to a woman who, at the time of his birth, was not enslaved. I don't know if she had ever been enslaved. But, we tend to want to look at slavery and how that affected the lives of Black people. But the story of Jacob Francis and his family looks at another angle and how slavery affected those Black people who were free, and how the racism that supported and justified in some people's minds the idea of slavery also affected those people who were free.
Yes. It rubbed off on everybody.
Absolutely.
Yes. That's
what I wanted to do with Jacob Francis' story was to show the complexities of the Black experience and not just have it focused on slavery.
Can you give us some examples of what you've discovered so far?
Well, I'm particularly looking at New Jersey, although Jacob Francis did spend 6 years of his life in Salem, Massachusetts, as a teenager and coming of age in Salem. But most of his life was spent here in New Jersey, in the area of Amwell Township near Flemington. And I found that as a free Black man, he had to find a way to overcome some laws and work around others, and also just in society, develop his ability to succeed to the extent that a white person would succeed and not be kept back. And he was very able to do that. And while he was involved in all of this, he did marry he married an enslaved woman. He had his involvement with slavery that way. It was a very interesting wedding that they had, because the owner of his wife, whose name was Mary, the owner actually sold her to Jacob on their wedding day. Now, one thing I would like to know is, did he sell her for market value to Jacob, or did he, just make it a token payment so that he could move her ownership to him so that he could then free her, which he did. He then did free her. That's important, because if he hadn't freed her and he had continued to be a slave owner himself, his children would have been enslaved, to him. But because she was free, they were born free. So he experienced very personally an enslaved person, and helped free her. And then both she and Jacob, as they raised their 8 children, helped them understand the problems of enslavement, as well as the problems encountered by free Black people, as the children were. And his youngest son, whose name was Abner, who was born about 1812, as Jacob was beginning to get a little older, Abner actually grew up to become an abolitionist and worked with Frederick Douglass as well as William Lloyd Garrison, and spent his adult life making a living as a merchant, but spending a good portion of his life working for the abolition of slavery. And he was particularly interested, as a Black abolitionist, in having abolition organizations get rid of the idea of colonization to go along with abolition. In other words, a lot of the early abolitionists were not interested in freeing enslaved people so that they could live equally with white people. They were interested in freeing them and then sending them back to Africa.
Yes, okay. You mentioned that.
The colonization was colonizing Africa back again, with Blacks who had been born in America and were just, their ancestry was African, and they're going back there. Because a lot of abolitionists didn't believe that white people and Black people could live equally together. They were racist, but they wanted to get rid of slavery. And Jacob and his son Abner, worked against that pretty consistently. So Abner's involvement in the revolution continued into the New Republic period, and certainly continued with his son Abner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it goes through the generations. It evolves through the generations. It doesn't just go away, does it?
No.
I think you mentioned this to me, that New Jersey did not have plantations, but they did have farms. So that if there were slave owners, they would only have a few slaves. They did not have massive numbers of them as they did in the South.
Right.
But nevertheless, they were still slaves.
Exactly. New Jersey had slavery probably the longest of the northern states. In many ways, New Jersey was more like a southern state in its rules about slavery and that sort of thing, even though the specific conditions of slavery were a bit different, like you say. You can find, I believe, in New Jersey's early colonial history, some examples of larger sort of plantation-like farms, but vast majority of them were smaller than that. It gets confusing because the term plantation was used to describe a farm in colonial New Jersey. And so a lot of people jump to the conclusion, okay, they were big places just like in the South, and there were big gangs of slaves and that kind of thing, but it really wasn't that way. Most slave owners in New Jersey owned 1, 2, or 3 at least male slaves. Male slaves are recorded more frequently than female slaves and children, so it's a little hard to tell sometimes exactly how many a person had, but it certainly was not a gang. And the enslaved people tended to live much closer to their owners and not be in a separate Black community like they were in the South on the plantations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, didn't I think it was in this article in the New York Times, they showed a little tiny wooden cabin where the slaves actually lived on the land that the farmers owned. Yeah, well, this is a part of our history that we haven't looked at, have we?
Not very much. That's what excited me about getting involved with it. Yeah, it just kept opening up new angles to me and new understandings to me, that I may have had some inclination of, but I certainly didn't understand in full detail.
Right. Well, where does this leave us at this point? I mean, we're now going through a new era, aren't we? Where there is an awareness and a need for change because people say Black Lives Matter. And how does this history, how does it work for us? Do we need to do something about this, or do we need to talk about it?
Yeah, the thing that has really struck me in working on this, particularly over the last year or so, I've been interested in Jacob for a longer period of time, but doing the really solid stuff and the writing and trying to put it all together is to notice just how what he experienced continues today. We haven't changed all that much. Wow. Now, let me modify that a little bit. I think at the time that Jacob lived, there was a great deal of systemic racism and there was a lot of social racism. There were white people who supported equal rights for Black people, who wanted to end slavery and end the discrimination, and who would go out of their way sometimes to help individual Black people. And Jacob, got some of that benefit himself. But throughout his life, all the way up to the Civil War, Blacks in New Jersey, free Blacks, had the specter of slavery hovering over them. People were captured and taken to the South and sold back into slavery. Black people in the North, after I believe it was 1798, a law was passed. They had to carry a pass proving they were free. If they traveled outside the county in which they lived, they had to have that pass. If they came into New Jersey from a state outside, they had to have a pass proving that they were free. So there was a lot of racism. Today, I don't think it is of the same magnitude as it was back then. I think there are more white people today who are helping to fight for the equal rights of Blacks and the end of racism and that sort of thing. But there still is enough hanging around that strikes me as very similar to what it was in the late 18th and early 19th century.
It's interesting. History of the present. The fact that you gathered so much knowledge about this man and his family, I have to ask you, you didn't find it in a book, did you? So how did you go about finding the information, and how did you discover it?
Well, notice that the working title and what may be the final title is The Revolutionary World of, okay? It's not stated as a biography of Jacob Francis, because to do a biography, you really need to know a great deal about what was going on in the mind of the individual you're studying. And if the person doesn't leave a lot of letters and diaries and, memoirs and things like that, it's very hard to do. So what I had to do was take a statement that he made in 1832 when he applied for a federal pension as a Revolutionary War veteran. And he actually made a very long statement, thank goodness. I said before he couldn't write, he dictated it, which was typical for the veterans to dictate it. It's a court document. They swear to tell the truth. They're before a court justice who is transcribing what they're dictating to him. And it was basically to prove that he had at least 2 years of service in the Continental Army or the New Jersey militia. And he had much more than that. And he also, thank goodness, went beyond his military service, which is really all he had to do. And he talked about his childhood. He talked about, you know, where he came from and what he had experienced, and even also some of the things after his military service got mentioned. It's very important and very good that when he died, that Mary, his widow, applied for a widow's pension. And she had to prove that she was married to him. She had to prove that he had qualified for a pension, and she had to prove that he no longer was alive so that she could take the pension. So there's a lot of documentation and a lot of accounts of people about her and about him and about their wedding and about their life after his military service that helped flesh out the story. But basically what I had to do was to learn as much as I could about the context of his life. In other words, when he was living in Salem, Massachusetts as an indentured servant for the 6 years from 1768 to 1775, and the revolution was developing all around him in Salem, Massachusetts, I had to look at what was the family doing who owned his time as an indentured servant. What were their involvement in the revolution? What events did he participate in or at least observe in Salem? What debates did he hear in Salem? Things like that that would have affected his life. And then once he's free from his indenture in January of 1775, how did he get involved enlisting in the Continental Army in a Massachusetts regiment at a time when George Washington was trying to keep Black men out of the Army? They had gotten into the Army because in New England, there wasn't as much opposition to Black soldiers fighting alongside white soldiers. And, you know, he was able to get in, even though Washington was trying to keep them out.
Why was Washington trying to keep them out? And what's the story behind what Washington was doing?
Well, he, along with a number of his officers, didn't believe that Blacks could fight as well as whites, that they wouldn't be as good soldiers. You know, there's a lot of racism in that line. There were a number of debates that took place among his officers as to the qualities of Blacks. There were a number of people outside of the top echelon of officers who commented about the bad quality of the Continental Army because there were so many Blacks, as well as young boys who weren't old enough to fight, men who were too old to fight, and then they would kind of group with them Black people, Black men of all ages. And even an important regiment like the Marbleheaders, you know, that helped get Washington across the Delaware and had a number of Black men. There's at least one man who commented on them saying they were, you know, an above average, a much better regiment than most of the early regiments from Massachusetts. The only problem was they had so many Blacks, and that really kind of took away from their notoriety, good notoriety. So he was fighting against that. I personally believe that Jacob, for whatever other reasons he signed up to join the Continental Army, he wanted to prove that Black men could be as good soldiers as white men. He wasn't trying to get his freedom by joining the Army because he wasn't enslaved. But I think he really wanted to prove that. Many of the men in Salem who were joining the Continental Army, the young men, wanted to prove their manhood in the white culture. You know, maybe they wanted to impress a girl, or they wanted to impress, you know, the family of girl that they were interested in, or maybe just their own family. They wanted to prove that they were now men. I think Jacob wanted to prove not only was he a 21, 22-year-old man, but he was just as good as white men, if not better. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. And you learned all of this, and this was not obviously out there for you. You really had to go digging for it, didn't you?
Yeah, I had to dig through a lot of, well,
Yeah.
his regimental records, I could go through. I could read diaries from other men in the regiment. And even if they don't specifically mention Jacob by name, I knew what situations his particular group was in, not just the Army in general, but very specific to his regiment and company. And one thing, the omission of his name is also significant because he does not appear in court-martial records as a military soldier who did bad things, in order to get a court-martial. He didn't desert. He didn't neglect his duty. He didn't, fire his gun when he wasn't supposed to. All the things that so many men in the Continental Army were doing to get a court-martial for. He also doesn't appear as ever being so sick that he couldn't be on duty. And he was in the Army at a time in 1775 when men were being dismissed from the Army right and left for illness, as well as for being wounded. And also men were deserting and being brought up on charges for that. He just doesn't appear in any of that. And so when at the end of his enlistment, which is just after the Battle of Trenton, he's one of the very few New Jersey-born people who served at the Battle of Trenton. When his enlistment was up, his regiment was decimated in the numbers of men. He was definitely a survivor of illness, of combat, etc., and just the neglect, in food, clothing, etc., that the Continental Army went through. That he demonstrated his abilities and his determination and all of that just to still be there at the Battle of Trenton.
And that was to remind some of us who don't remember the American Revolution that well, the Battle of Trenton was a deciding turning point, wasn't it?
Yes, the Battle of Trenton combined with the following 9 days to the Battle of Princeton, what's historians call the 10 crucial days. Trenton was the first day, Princeton was the 10th day. And in that 10 days, Washington turned things around very significantly because on December 25th, 1776, the British basically controlled New Jersey. They occupied New Jersey with troops and had pretty much displaced the New Jersey Patriot government. And the loyalists in New Jersey were feeling very supported, and they want to get back at the Patriots. And the Patriots are feeling abandoned by Washington and the Continental Congress because the troops are now all over in Bucks County, because they had left New Jersey. And by the end of the 10 days after the Battle of Princeton, Washington goes to Morristown for winter encampment, and the British fall back to New Brunswick and east of New Brunswick. So most of New Jersey is opened up to Continental and Patriot control again. So that was really, Battle of Trenton started that process that enabled him to essentially retake New Jersey.
So he was in some very vital places.
Yes. Now, I have to say that Jacob was not at the Battle of Princeton. His enlistment was up on December 31st, and Princeton was January 3rd, and Washington's army was disintegrating on December 31st because so many of the men had 1-year enlistments that ended that date. Jacob was just one of those couple thousand men whose enlistment was up that day. And Washington tried to get the men to extend their enlistment for 6 weeks. And Jacob was one who decided not to do that. He decided not to do that because he hadn't seen mom for about a decade. And he also didn't know his family name. He only knew his first name, Jacob. Yes. And he wanted to find mom, and he wanted to find out who he was.
Who he was. We have to move along. You have something to share with us. You have something you're going to put up that you were going to share with us.
I wanted to share with you this screen, which shows on the left-hand side his obituary. And then I've just given you some ideas of what was in that. I was struck by this obituary, which was published in a local Flemington newspaper, his obituary written by the local editor of that paper. And then, as you can see, it also was reprinted in Cleveland, Ohio. The newspaper picked it up there and reprinted it. This, as I looked through the Flemington newspaper at that time, most obituaries were really just death notices and gave the man's age, location, cause of death, and maybe a word or two about them. This really tells and summarizes his whole life in Flemington and points out what a significant person he was. This is totally unheard of for a Black man at that time. And, you have to wonder, is it because he was so much like a white man, if you will, that the editor made a big deal out of this? The editor, one must understand, was one who believed in colonization, sending the Blacks back to Africa. He supported those organizations. And yet here he found a Black man whom he could praise. At the same time, he was advocating for sending them back to Africa.
Well, Larry, you have done a wonderful job. Your research is so interesting. Your book, when is it going to come out soon?
Not soon, but it's getting to the point where it's ready to go to editors at the publisher and things like that, and have some people read it and make some recommendations and all that. So certainly within the next year, it'll be out.
Well, we look forward to seeing your book, to reading your book. There's wonderful, wonderful research. And I want to thank you so much for being who you are, Larry Kidder. And thank you so much for coming today to talk.
And I thank you for inviting me to come, Joan. It's been great talking with you.
It has been great. Thank you so much, Larry, for coming to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. Goodbye.